Hey guys, welcome to Book Review 165. Today I am going to be reviewing all the way around 17,000 kilometers, 16 months, 2 pairs of underwear, and a circumnavigation of Australia by kayak by Stuart Trueman. Okay, so as the title suggests, Stuart is a kayaker that did the whole of Australia. He kind of was always sort of an adrenaline addict, but in his youth he was a mountain climber, specifically climbing a lot of the hard faces in Europe in the Alps. But he immigrated with his family to Australia, and because of knee problems and just an inability to climb, he took up kayaking as sort of a second way to meet that adrenaline need. Excuse me. So he started out in Broome, Australia for his circumnavigation. Now this is different than the two previous people that had circumnavigated Australia. Him being only the third person to accomplish this task. And he was actually the first person to do it with no land support. Now that doesn't mean that people didn't help him from the land or he didn't get, parcels or whatever. But he didn't have someone follow him around the country like in a truck or a convoy, giving him supplies every time he pulled into the beach. He kind of worked that out with various people along the way. And it's not like he didn't have any supply help. He had a lot of that, but it was just kind of, he had to figure it out at each point rather than have that all worked out for him. But anyway, he started in Broome, and the reason he started in Broome, even though his home is in Sydney and the two previous expeditions had started in Sydney, was because of weather. He wanted to get into the west coast, like during the season when the winds would be with him, as well as like the south during the wintertime, which, if you know Australia, that's the coldest part of Australia. But it actually made sense in terms of the swells and being able to navigate the waters. It would be almost impossible to navigate those waters during the winter. So, from Broome, his first day out, he actually got dehydrated trying to cross the Roebuck's Bay, I believe, and described it as one of his hardest days in the whole trip. So that's an inauspicious way to start. And he actually, I think, had to go back to Broome and restart again after he got dehydrated on that first time. But between Broome and Exmouth, it was pretty calm sailing. He stayed at a number of Aboriginal camps along the way, this being a part of Australia that is mostly deserted of people, and so he was kind of more left to his own devices. Had some problems in, I think, Onslow. Also got to see Coral Bay, some of the reefs around there. But for the most part, he didn't do too much tourist stuff. He just kind of stuck to his route. Where his route really first kind of became interesting was the Zeedorp Cliffs. Now, before the Zeedorp Cliffs is Shark Bay, which he said was some of the easiest sailing that he's done in his whole life. This is being a protected bay that's a World Heritage Site that has just a couple meters of very calm water with seagrass. He saw a lot of dungaros, also known as sea cows. They're kind of like seals, and sharks will have a tendency to attack them, but not very often. He also met some sharks that would, along the north that would hit up along his boat. But the sharks, unlike the crocs that we'll meet towards the end of the book, really have no ill will against humans. It's more curiosity. And they can certainly be dangerous, but Stuart was less wary of them than he was of the crocs on the top end. He also had, whenever he paddled at night, which he didn't like to do that much, but he occasionally had the opportunity to, there was luminescence in the water, which is a type of plankton that lights up when disturbed. So you probably, if you're listening to me ramble, you've probably seen the videos of the calm waters in the open ocean where it's like that. But After Sharks Bay, he goes to the Zdorp Cliffs. Cliffs. This is one of three cliffs that he stretches of cliffs that he has to navigate in his voyage around Australia. And specifically, it's the amount of time it takes to go along these cliffs. I think this one was like 210 kilometers, and then the other two were like 180 and 190 respectively. So we're talking like I forget what his clip rate was, but we're talking like 36 hours, 48 hours of just continuous sailing without being able to pull yourself onto the shore and make a proper camp. So, needless to say, he was quite exhausted by the end of it. And by the time he got to Kilbarry, there was actually a local shoreman, like a police officer for the shore, I guess, shore patrol, that pulled him through the reefs because he was just almost, or led him through the reefs because he was almost too exhausted. And there was a lot of sort of, it was a very tricky landing spot. So who knows if he would have made it if it wasn't for that generous shore patrolman. Going south goes through Geraldton, Jurgen Bay. He always camps at night along these places, and depending on how big the town is really kind of how much hassle he has. Now, a lot of times he would go into a town, and particularly later in the journey, someone would recognize him and give him, like free accommodation or whatever. But early on, he got some resistance going into towns, and specifically like around Perth, he got a lot of resistance. He had to be really sort of on the quiet. Or if he was close to like a caravan park, he would rent like a caravan park, a spot at a caravan park. But that involved dragging his, I don't know, like 80 kilogram, something like that, kayak, which was just loaded with supplies, all the way up the beach and all the way to the caravan park. And he'd always have to drag him up the beach to a degree, because one of the big things is he wouldn't always have to. If you landed at high tide, then he'd only have to drag it a little bit. But if you're at low tide and you land, you can't set up your tent there because the tide will come in overnight and you'll be swamped. So it was always just kind of a rigmarole coming in and coming out. Definitely you get the impression that the most stressful part of kayaking was the landings and taking off in the morning. Really, it was more just sort of like in a long distance endurance game, like during the day, of just like, I need X amount of, calories, food. I really enjoy doing this. I'm getting that adrenaline high, but like the risk was, this is once you got out to like open ocean, was crashing in the waves or crashing on a reef or crashing into some rocks as he was coming and going. But anyway, it gets down to Perth. I think around Perth was maybe where he broke his hand. Or no, he didn't break his hand, but he had like a stress fracture from the type of paddle he was using. So he changed out his paddle. Got south of Perth, saw Miranda, Margaret River, saw some of the tricky headlands of Cape Nastralisti and Cape Lituan. I'm sure I'm mongering that. But was able to get around those. And well, what else about this area? I feel like I'm mongrelling this to a degree. It seems like the Southwest was actually a kind of like, there were a lot of different winds going in different ways, but it wasn't that hard because he was able to, there were like a lot of sheltered bays along that area too. I think that's what he said. Anyway, heads up goes to Esperance, and Esperance is the start of the Great Australian Bight. So, the Great Australian Bight had two of the cliffs, sets of cliffs, in addition to the Zdorp cliffs that he had to cross. The first one, I think it was the first one, yeah. Yeah, I think it is the Baxter Cliffs. The Baxter Cliffs is when he ran into the authorities. And unlike the authorities at the Zdorp Cliffs, they did not want him to cross. They said that they were going to fine him if he did. They said it was protected waters, which was true for whale mating season. But then again, at the same time, the reason that they're protected waters is for giant outboard motor boats and giant, trawling boats. I seriously doubt like a one man in a kayak is going to disturb the mating patterns of giant, I'm not sure what kind of whales they were, but the whales that congregated in the area. So he waited and waited and waited, and eventually just said, "Screw the authorities, I'm going to go." So he went. He had to. This was one of the probably even more than the Zydorp cliffs. This was the cliffs. This was one of the harder cliffs that he really had to kind of like. He said that he talked to himself and shouted out instructions to himself in order to tell him what he needed to do to cross the cliffs. And then when he got to the other side, he met actually a group of, and let's not underplay how exhausted he was. He met a group of fishermen that were kind of on the low-key fishing in the off-season, just line fishing. And they said they gave him a meal, and circumstances considered, it was probably the best meal that he had in his whole life. That was in Twilight Cove. Eventually goes up to Eucla, which is not even a town. It's sort of like a border outpost between South Australia and Western Australia, where he got supplies shipped in. At more remote spots, he couldn't just go into town. He would have to get supplies like pre-shipped to like a certain drop-off point. Obviously, like dried goods, nothing that can spoil, or canned goods. And then he'd go and he'd pick them up. Next, he hit the Boonda Cliffs. Again, very hard, very stressful. Gets over those, reaches the head of the Bight, which is kind of like the Australian Bight is sort of like a curve like this of ocean into the continent of Australia, and the head of the Bight is like the most northerly part of where the ocean reaches into Australia. It's also very close to the first town, which is, I believe it's Fowler's Bay. And I think it's in Fowler's Bay that he actually had to get like a transport into town, and it was a bit of a rigmarole because the town wasn't actually on the ocean like he thought it was going to be. Goes around to Sedunda, Ellison, Coffin Bay, crosses over I think it's called the Bay of Adelaide or something like that, to eventually Adelaide, where he meets his family at a preordained time. But this was also a sort of changing point in the book too, because this is when he gave his first speech, and it became sort of public knowledge what he was doing. Previously, he kind of kept it on the down low, his intention to go all the way around Australia. But by Adelaide, he was either going to have to take he was starting to run out of money. He was either going to have to take a bank loan or find another source of income. And luckily, he met with the local kayaking club, and they realized what exactly he was trying to do, which was big. Not to mention the fact that he was already about 40% around the continent. So he had the chops. It wasn't just talk. And basically, like, donations and various grants supplied him the rest of the way around Australia. So that was certainly fortuitous. Met his family. Oh, let's go past Adelaide. Had to get to the Korong, which is like marshland. So it's not like a cliffs where you can't park, but it's not exactly like clean beach where you can just land. This is like the delta, essentially, of the Murray River, the longest river, I believe, the longest river system in Australia. And so he had to kind of navigate the mangroves and get through all that. So in a way, kind of just as stressful as cliffs, even though maybe not the danger of going up against the rocks and in an area that was a little bit more populated. Goes around to Victoria, sees the Seven Sisters and what are some of these places? Port Campbell, the Wye River, all these different places. He does not go up into Melbourne. He just immediately crosses over whatever that little area is in the Melbourne Harbor or the Melbourne Bay or whatever they call that. Something I remember that he said during this time period is he kind of skips over it somewhat because he said that his recording device wasn't working. This section is a little bit shorter compared to what it would be. Now, one thing that he did mention was he met somebody that was just kayaking or like around Melbourne, or around, not Melbourne, but the Bass Strait, south of Melbourne, between Melbourne and Tasmania. And that person thought that they were doing, he kind of kept it on the sly what he was doing, because this person thought that they were doing something epic by, I don't know, I don't think it was crossing the Bass Strait. I think it was just like a long day kayak. But he really, as with another story later in the book, he mentions how inspirational it is, kind of the individual stories, because he was an adrenaline junkie, and so constantly had to look for the higher, as in going all the way around Australia, whereas the neophyte that was able to just enjoy kayaking for just on a day trip, even in calm waters, really inspired him and pushed him through all the way through the journey. Visually makes his way around the lake's entrance and then heads up towards Sydney. He mentioned that this was some of his favorite parts because, again, much like I think parts of the Southwest, it was kind of like beach headland, which means that there was a lot of sheltered bays, which means that it made entering and exiting very easily, and as I mentioned, the most difficult part. So he really enjoyed that. After giving some speeches in Sydney, he was off to the northern part of New South Wales and into Queensland. What I specifically remember about this part is once he gets north of Brisbane, he enters the Great Barrier Reef area, which means that there weren't, I think, as many waves, but there were like a lot of very strange currents. And also the other thing is that because the breaker for the reef is so far out during the Great Barrier Reef, I mean, it's a huge, you have a huge area. It's not like the reefs that are like on the shore in other parts of Australia. You have this huge area, this highway almost, of calm waters that you can go up through. Seeing some of the military camps around, what was that, Shoalwater Bay, I think? Sees the White Sunday Islands and see how beautiful it is, and sees why it's so popular among kayakers to go to the White Sundays. Sees the destruction of Mission Beach and sort of the blandness of Townsville before eventually heading up to Cairns. And then Cairns, he had to make really his preparations for the final push, because again, he would be getting out of the populated areas into some of the most remote coastline in Australia, which means a lot more danger of isolation, and isolation means less supplies, and it can potentially mean death if you don't know what you're doing. So, Cairns to Darwin. That's this next section. This is also when he starts getting into croc country. The biggest battle through this section would be crocs. This is some of the the calmest waters in all of Australia. You know, like the Roaring Forties goes around the east and the west section of Australia, and particularly around the Australian Bight in the south, making the waves really strong. But in the north, they're very, very calm. So waves really weren't a problem. Crocs were a big problem. Tides were also a problem. The tides, as I know as I am in Darwin right now, in the north end are extreme, like 8 or 9 meters. So he would really, really have to time out his days so that he'd reach on high tide, because it would be just a disaster trying to, and that's not like 8 meters this way, that's like 8 meters, 8 or 9 meters this way, which means that like the distance could be like 200 or 300 meters or 400 meters, dragging a 80 kilo or 90 kilo kayak through the exposed beach. And oftentimes the exposed beach was not hard compact sand, but was actually mud flats. And so it would be nearly impossible to drive it through a mud flat, because your legs would just sink down and the kayak would sink into the mud, and it would just be a disaster. So that was very important for him. Let's see. What parts of the northern part stand out? I already mentioned the Crocs. Um, Definitely the remoteness. Let's see. Waipea. He sees a lot of sort of these little kind of cattle towns or kind of random towns or whatever. Fishing is real big in the north, though he said that the fishermen tended to be a little bit reclusive. The ones that were not reclusive were very nice to him. They would give him food and shelter and all sorts of stuff. But the vast majority of them, I guess, fishermen have a tendency to be kind of in their own world and cranky, and they certainly lived up to that to a degree. He decided to not cross the. It doesn't even say what the Gulf is. Gulf of. It's not Tribulation. I don't know, but whatever that Gulf is that separates Cape York from the top end. The two previous people that had kayaked this had gone straight across, whereas he did the slow route, going around all the mangrove forests around the very large Gulf itself. This Gulf probably being about the size of Papua New Guinea or something. Yeah, meets a lot of cool people. Gets rescued once by a supplied boat for the trawlers. So it wasn't a trawling boat, but it was like a supply boat, and they essentially fed him like grilled prawns and coffee, and like he ate, and he could contact his wife because they had like a cellular or like a satellite phone. So he was able to do that. The only during the I'm going to backtrack a little bit. During the Great Australian Bight, he took a satellite phone, but other than that, he only took like an emergency location device that he could click, and then they would come, like an emergent, like the flying doctors or the emergency rescue crew could come and get him. Now that being said, he tested it twice, and neither time it worked. So, so much for backup plans. Goes to Groot Eylet, Cape Arnhem, Echo Island. Talks about some of the currents around the north end. That's where we are now. And just how, yeah, that being said, they're not waves, but depending on where you are, the currents are very strong. So, particularly around, what is it, Dundas Straits and Cape Keith, there were very strong currents, but he was also able to kind of time out his day so that the currents flowed with him instead of flowed against them. Eventually got into Darwin, and we're on to our next section. Resupplied there, and then there were numerous stories, as I said, of crocs. He had crocs that were within a few meters of him a couple times. He saw crocs that would, what's ominous about crocs is like when the water is murky, as often it is in kind of the estuary areas of the top end, you see the croc eyes, and then when they see you, they sink down. And then you know that there's a saltwater croc in there that can kill a human, and has it in its instincts to kill humans, or at least large animals. But you can't see it. So it certainly took brass balls to be able to do that. Kind of hits up some of the last places, including Breckneck Harbor, Coolin Island, Montgomery Reef. Somewhere along here, he met like a nature family that they didn't have any kids, but they were like elderly, like 60s or 65 or something now, that ran this retreat like on this island, and it was kind of ramshackle, but was attractive in like a ramshackle way, because it was just them. There was no like superficiality of, like a hotel chain or something like that. So he met them and had good times with them, and they gave him the dude gave him the full moon salute when he was leaving. And then he finally crossed the King Sound with its giant tides, its king tides, and made his way onto Broome and completed the circumnavigation of Australia. So I'm sure this book is so dense with stuff that isn't just like about listening to place names, be it his supplies, what he needed, all that kind of stuff. But if you want a really entertaining read, I wouldn't say necessarily that it has a lot of larger societal value. that might be a unjust criticism, but like it's not like a book that really covers all of Australia. It covers his journey. But if you want an adventure book that is really, really good, check it out. All the way around, 17,000 kilometers, 16 months, and two pairs of underwear, and the circumnavigation of Australia by kayak by Stuart Trueman. All right, you guys, check out some more of my reviews. See you later. Bye.